Greetings and welcome to the Center for Global Development. It's my pleasure today to welcome Roland Siller from KfW in Germany to talk a little bit about his and KfW's perspective on the impact of COVID, not just in the immediate impact in terms of what they're doing, but also in terms of how it's likely to play out in the years to come. So Roland, welcome. It's a great pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, Masood. Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure from our side also to talk about these perspectives and really transformative impacts that COVID-19 has on developing world.
Well, transformative is indeed what it looks like it's going to be for so many of the organizations that are involved in development finance. And I wanted perhaps just to start off with a little bit of a sense of what the immediate impact has been on you, on your organization, both in terms of financing, but also in terms of business model. And obviously, most people know that KfW operates both within Germany and internationally, and there are lessons, no doubt, to be learned from one to the other. So it would be good to get a little bit of your sense of the overall impact first.
Yeah, thank you. I would say it was a quite traumatic situation as crisis hit developed world first. And as you said, we are in both worlds. Our Minister of Finance announced that there is no limit to lending, which is quite a challenge if you are a backbone of the economic policy in Germany. So we prepared very fast under lockdown conditions, a huge package to keep the German economic system afloat. So that was really a big challenge. We had to mobilize our IT. We had to try things that we've never tried before from distance. So that was really a shock from the start, and we managed to do so. We were kind of surprised really how well it went because everybody really cooperated. The banks in the system, we went through the banks, our internal systems worked better than we thought. And in parallel, we started talks with our government. What can we do for the developing world? What could be looking a package like? What are the funds from the budget you can get? And the government was very motivated and supportive. And I can say since March, let's say 3 months, we put together a support package of around 5 billion, which we've been very proud of because that means 50% more in commitments than last year. And at the same time, government committed to continue in 21, saying the crisis will not be over. We are very early days in the crisis in the developing world. So, and that is something we are working on now. And I'm also proud to say that the first billion is already signed with the partners that we have.
And just to give us a little bit of a sense of where in the developing world, and are we talking about this is providing immediate financing that disperses quickly, or are these commitments that will take some years to disperse, in which case they don't really provide the same kind of immediate help that countries need? Is it to the public sector or the private sector? It's a little bit of sense of that would be great.
Sure. I mean, speed matters and liquidity matters. That is quite obvious. So we focused on immediate emergency measures in the health sector, equipment for laboratories, safety equipment, expanding hospitals. Like in Iraq, we financed 4 hospitals. So that is one, emergency support for health sector. Second was liquidity for governments. Often that is the very hard hit emerging larger economies like Brazil, India, in co-financing social protection programs. So those are relatively large sums financed by us through loans in Africa or least developing countries, mostly through grants. So that was package number 2. And the third is we have a number of national development banks in our network that play an important role in supporting their local national economies, SMEs, larger companies. So we put also a quite important part of the financing there. So the liquidity disperses fast. And sometimes we also manage, like in Peru, we have sort of a hybrid program where we say you can disperse liquidity fast, but for the second round, we want to see green investments. We know speed matters now, but to rebuild it, we want to see a different kind of approach.
So you raised a couple of things that would be worth maybe probing a little bit more. One is really the balance between providing immediate liquidity and support, and clearly that's what countries need right now. But many people are beginning to think about the recovery now. Mm-hmm. And I think we know that the recovery in many developing countries is going to be challenging. It's going to be multi-year because first of all, they have to retrace and catch up with a setback that's happened now. Many countries have been pushed back, so they have to come back to the same starting point in a way that they were, and then make progress from there. But secondly, also there's perhaps a renewed attention on some areas where we were underinvesting. Pandemic preparation is really the most obvious case, but climate change very quickly coming behind. So how we think about the agenda going forward, we have to balance a little bit speed, but also with content and focus and sustainability. And for you, climate change has been an increasing feature of your operations, and fighting climate change has been very much part of that. And in Europe now, we've all seen the recent commitments coming from not just the European Commission, but also from national leadership about ensuring that the recovery is green. How do you see that playing out in your international work? How much is that going to be a central feature of your work going forward?
I'm pretty sure that this will be a very, very important feature, let's say in phase 2 coming to 21, because that means to use this opportunity where there's a transformation taking place anyway, however we take it, from whatever angle we take it, and to use this information for good. How can we make economies more resilient, health systems more resilient, and the country as such for the climate change more resilient? So not only about mitigation, but also business models who can withstand climate change, adaptation of infrastructure and whatnot to climate change and the changing weather conditions. So I think these 3 parts, resilience to pandemics, so let's have a systemic approach on health, One Health as it is often called, and the second is also on the economic sector. If we see changing patterns in international integration, will we have more regionalization? Is something taking place? Do we have to take it into account if we finance business model? And the third is clearly climate change. And we have a lot of experience in Germany and abroad. About 55% of what we do is climate finance related in the developing world. And I have to say, before the crisis hit, there was a huge amount of interest in our markets. How can you help us with green bonds, with local capital markets on that side? How did you do it? Would you support us in climate adaptation? So the Global Fund is playing an important role. So I think all these, the basis is here. We have to retake it, have to retake a fresh start and make it happen start in 21. So in 20, under lockdown conditions, to prepare something new where you cannot travel, to find new partners is really, really hard. And it will be a challenge in 21 as well.
Yes, I think it might take us a little bit longer to get to the point where enough people have access to the vaccine and And also there's enough confidence amongst people to take advantage of the vaccine and to be at a position where then the situation normalizes in enough places that people can begin to resume the sort of operations. I suspect also that much of what we do now through Zoom calls like this one, we will continue to do. And it'll be the new hybrid model that we're going to try to find. But you're right, it'll take a little bit of time. So climate is going to be one driver, climate change and making sure the recovery is green. Another worry that many people have talking about the recovery is to make sure it's inclusive, because we already see that inequality is likely to be worsened from the pandemic. The people who get hit the most in a lockdown are the ones that are in the informal sector, that earn a daily wage, that don't have access to healthcare. It's the women and the children in many societies, girls who are dropping out of school may not go back. And so when we start thinking about the recovery, we also want to make sure that the recovery is adequately focused on bringing in the marginalized and the inclusive, in an inclusive way. I want to get a little bit of a sense, when you're a development bank, a little bit harder for you to be directly focused on projects of this nature, but in your own operations, how do you think about these issues? How do you make sure that the work that you do, the loans you're providing, the grants that you're making, take on board the need to ensure that we try and have a recovery from which everyone can benefit and in which everyone can contribute?
I think you're absolutely right. This is very important and not so easy to do for a development bank. I think first, what is very important is that we all have to work very hard that the crisis is not too deep and not too pronounced. Because I think that is the priority number one if we don't want to have people dipping into absolute poverty. So really try to flatten it out and come back faster and earlier. Second is, I think really what we've learned from many countries, the direct support through liquidity of social security systems where they exist. Can be more developed systems, can be cash transfers, can be cash for work. I think that is something that we have to use without any, let's say, philosophical or other regret, but say, okay, that is very important. Those are powerful tools to help people to make ends meet, to keep children at school and so on and so forth. I think that's very important. Support social security networks, cash transfers. Thirdly, I think we have to take a clear look when we look into recovery on how to support institutions that are very close to the poor. For banks that might be microfinance institutions, there are also NGOs who are doing a lot in the social security side to support the very poor. I think those are the, let's say, the target institutions where we would like to finance and support that they can continue doing their work. And maybe a third part is to have labor-intense recovery in some parts, to really look into our investments in infrastructure. Can we do it a way that local employment is generated, at least for a time, until then the national economy is jumping back and will create more sustainable jobs. That is more or less in a mix, I think, what we are looking at.
Yes, and I think what you just outlined seems to me is the key is going to be for you and for other organizations that are involved in different bits of this exercise to be able to find ways to partner together and to talk to each other, to have plans and strategies that are mutually reinforcing rather than all working in parallel. And that kind of brings me a little bit to a bigger question of how we see the mosaic of development finance changing over the coming decade, as it has been changing over the past decade. So maybe it's an accelerator now with the pandemic, things will happen faster. So, one of the things that's become so clear is development banks, international development banks, regional development banks, institutions like yours, other European institutions like AFD, Asian institutions, Chinese development banks are now huge, right, in terms of their role, whether it's the CDB or others. And in some ways, we think of development banking. You have the big international institutions, and obviously they the World Bank, regional banks, and then you have other institutions like the ones that you represent. And then now in countries themselves, many countries have a development bank. Developing countries now have a development bank. And there's been a big discussion about how the role of these organizations still always have the same perspectives naturally, because there are many more varied, but how one can have some common principles and approaches that run through. There is a big summit of in Paris, or these days it's in Paris, but it's on virtually, I presume, as well, coming up on finance in common, which is going to bring this together. And I want to get a little bit of sort of your perspective, but also what is the current thinking amongst your colleagues and in Germany as we think about the sort of future of development banks and development finance more generally? How do you see these different trends coming together?
I think the feeling of my colleagues, I would say, is that the challenge is so big that we cannot walk alone. That would be really, it's quite obvious we have to walk together. And now you look into transaction costs. With how many can you walk at the same time? That's a challenge. We are part of Team Europe, and there's a big effort here to do something meaningful together, to the planning together, and have a strong impact here. So I think that is a very strong part. I myself, it's part of my DNA. I spent some time at Agence Française, for instance. So we do have personal exchange programs. We have joint strategic meetings with Asian Development Bank, for instance. We just financed the COVID response in Indonesia together. We put 450 million, Asian Development Bank, even more than that. So this is happening. We have joint plans, and also, but we saw it only works where we have joint focal areas. As you said, focus is very important. Otherwise, transaction costs go through the roof at our place, but also in our partner countries. So I would very much argue to look into who are the best partners in a given content and context. And we want to partner with those to learn, to contribute, and to bring our experience. You cannot sit around a table with 50 people and do something very fast in a meaningful manner. I mean, as a development bank, I would say on the political level, I think it's a different story. So I would say cooperation is very important. Cooperation with the new development banks, same thing. We had very close cooperation on standards, for instance, with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So we had delegated people who worked initially on their environmental standards, and they were very open for intake and experience. So I think there is something happening where a lot of standards are, let's say, are really coming together to the same level. Sure, you might have other different political agendas, but on the standard side, I think there has been a lot of progress over the last years, and there needs to be progress over the coming years. So changing structure is that type of cooperation. The second, I would say, as we talk today, is digitalization. This is in our workday, and we invested a lot those last years, and we have to accelerate on remote management, remote verification. How can we use cameras, digital satellite photos to see, for instance, how is deforestation going on? How are plans that we agreed upon are really implemented? So there's a lot we can use, a lot more than we know about today. And I'm very confident with the very young people that we take in every day from the job market that do know much more about IT than we do. I think this part to ingrain it in our daily work and also in our project will change a lot the way we work in a positive manner. And last but not least, a theme that is very important we didn't talk about is mobilizing of local capital markets, of private sector, de-risking their investment, so to create markets. I think that is a constant battle that we have to continue.
Exactly. I think you made a very important point, which is that, we should, I think we have to have a mindset which recognizes that, given the nature of the challenge, we have to be working with others to make any progress. At the same time, we don't have to work with everyone all the time on everything. Yeah. The purpose is not to collaborate for the sake of collaboration. It is to collaborate to advance the agenda better. Yeah. And finding that balance is going to be the challenge for leaders like yourself in the system, as to where and how you draw the line. And then there are some partners that are probably easier to work with, in the sense that they have similar approaches, similar priorities and mindsets, and but the challenge is also to reach out beyond them, so that we don't always just have the usual suspects sitting around the table.
Absolutely.
And having a constructive conversation, but then there's a separate world going on the side that maybe where we need to make an effort to reach out also. And I'm sure you're thinking about that as well as you go forward. Can we just end perhaps on, there is a debate now going on about sort of debt and debt forgiveness and debt sustainability and debt suspending debt service, and so far it's been very much focused on the poorest countries, and there is, as you know, at the moment an initiative that was sponsored by the G20, whereby the official development agencies have suspended debt service collection from 70-some countries, at least through the end of this year, and probably going to be extended through to the middle of next year. There is, however, also an emerging conversation, not just about postponing the collection of debt service, but what will need to be done to deal with levels of debt stock that are unsustainably high for some set of countries. We don't really know how many yet. We have to work through, because it depends on how bad the pandemic is. But many started with a bad situation, so maybe 20, something like that. And then the question becomes sort of how one approaches that, and what role the development bank should play in helping to solve that problem, and what instruments they have. I would just kind of get a little bit of your sense of how this conversation or this debate is progressing, I mean, directly in your own organization, because it's obviously a party, has an interest in thinking about this for itself, but also beyond that.
I think that is a very difficult one. I think foremost, it's for me a question of let's say, global politics in that regard, with IMF, the G20, looking at that. And if the necessity there is, like we found in the first debt moratorium, I think it's quite obvious that we need to act. We cannot load the countries if the debt stock is too high. I think we need a clear analysis where that is necessary. We also need some discipline where the money is going. And then we need clear-cut political decisions how that will go forward. We as a government bank would then follow our government in that sense that we accompany whatever decision will be made on that side. I think that is quite obvious. Yeah, debt relief is always a tricky question, especially if we move out from the very poor countries. We have a situation with the pandemic where they are in trouble without their own wrongdoing. Debt relief, if you have a situation where countries have indebted themselves and did invest in a very unresponsible manner, is a bit more difficult to judge. So I think they're really experts that know much better than I do around the world. For us, it's quite obvious there may be a necessity to do that, but that has to be carefully analyzed and discussed on a political level with all the pros and cons and ups and downs, and to, if necessary, support a faster recovery that we all want.
Yes. I think it's very important, as you say, that we think about, debt relief as an instrument, not as an objective. It's for what purpose and in what context, as you say. And right now, there is a need for liquidity, so it's a useful instrument to provide liquidity. In the end, the amount of liquidity being provided actually turns out to be about half of what people had hoped for at the beginning for a variety of reasons, but it's providing some help in the near term. And longer term, you have to think about it in the same way. And perhaps the point you made about middle income countries, I mean, in a way, for them, the main source of finance, apart from their own resources, is always going to come from financial markets, capital markets. And one of the roles of development banks could be to help them bridge back to markets through different ways of credit enhancement or risk mitigation. How much in your own work is that a focus in terms of helping countries come back to capital markets, private capital markets, through risk mitigation instruments or other ways?
Honestly, so far, very limited. That is a discussion that we might have with countries that have an interest in that, but I think that mainly would go to, let's say, World Bank and others for the time being. I think if I look at the scale of what we do in the given countries, it's not, let's say, on that scale that we could, I think, all by ourselves build that bridge. So either there is a joint work that is done where we could fit in, but doing it ourselves wasn't an option so far, to be very honest. What we are doing, or what we did in the last years, more on a level below that, is looking into green bonds and to see how we can support corporates, for instance, in Latin America, where we launched a fund on green bonds for corporates, more on that level that is better, let's say, tailored to the size of what we could invest. We would not say no, we would look at it if there's an interest and see how maybe we can jointly do it with others.
Yes.
But so far we haven't been asked for on the other side. So let's see. I mean, as you said, we have to evolve. We have to look into new instruments every day. And if there's a strong demand from that side, we would look into that, certainly.
Well, certainly, as you say, at the moment, there is so much to do. And I mean, you have been providing direct financial support and also helping to develop local capital markets, which is going to be a big part of the future of development finance, because so many of these economies are so heavily concentrated in terms of banking sector as being the bulk of their financial sector. We need to sort of start going into other kinds of financial markets, both fixed income and equity markets and developing those over time. So I think it's a big part there. So I think, as you say, everybody will have a lot of work and challenges ahead. Roland, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk. I think a lot of people will be interested in how the work that you're doing can contribute both directly and in terms of catalyzing this process of partnership across development banks. So we look forward to that. I hope we'll be able to have this conversation again in the future.
Will be my pleasure. Thank you so much, Masood. It really was enjoyable talking to you. And I hope we'll see each other very soon in the future.
I look forward to that.